Unrequited love in midlife melancholy. The silence in Arthur's flat was a presence, not an absence. It was the hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of the central heating, the distant gauzy murmur of London traffic 5 stories below. He was learning its textures, this silence, the way a man learns the contours of a solitary cell. Retirement had gifted him this, an endless, intimate acquaintance with quiet. He was preparing a single chicken breast, seasoning it with a precision that felt both futile and necessary, when the email arrived. The soft ping from the laptop on the kitchen counter was an event. It was from Leo. The name on the screen caused a small, seismic shift in his chest, a sensation so long dormant he'd mistaken it for forgotten. Subject: found this, thought of you. Attached was a scanned image of a faded theater program from 1982. A Midsummer Night's Dream. Leo had been a bombastic Theseus, Arthur a quietly competent Philostrate. Below the image, the message was breezy, unburdened. Can you believe it's been over 40 years? Hope you're well, Leo. Arthur's hand, still dusted with rosemary, went to his sternum. 40 years. It was an abstraction, a history book measurement, until Leo's name made it feel like yesterday. Their friendship had been a 5-act play performed in the wings of each other's lives. They'd met at university, 2 young men drawn together by a shared love of words and a contrasting magnetism. Arthur, introverted, watchful, finding his confidence in the ordered world of stage management. Leo, all easy charm and sprawling energy, a natural Oberon who expected the world to be his forest. Arthur had fallen in love not with a sudden, dramatic crash, but with a slow, inexorable settling, like dust in a sunbeam. He'd watched Leo fall in and out of love with women. His affection a bright, careless coin he spent freely, never noticing the currency Arthur hoarded uselessly in his own pockets. He never spoke of it. To name it would have been to break the delicate diorama of their friendship. Instead, he became Leo's most constant audience, his quietest confidant, the keeper of his minor histories. It was a life lived in the subtext, and he had, over the decades, convinced himself it was enough. Now Leo was back in London. The email led to a lunch, which led to a cautious reactivation of their old dynamic. They met in a modern brasserie, all polished concrete and reclaimed wood, a world away from the sticky carpeted pubs of their youth. Leo was still handsome, though age had worked on him with a heavier hand. His hair, once a wild dark mane, was a close-cropped silver fuzz. His expansive gestures were slightly smaller, as if life had gradually reduced his scale. But the energy was the same, the laugh that turned heads, the easy way he commanded the space around him. He talked of his 2 divorces, his successful property development business, his grown children who lived in Sydney and called him on birthdays. His life sounded like a series of transactions, some profitable, some not. Arthur listened, nodding, his own life feeling scant by comparison. What was there to say? That his career as a librarian had been quiet and fulfilling. That his marriage to Claire had been one of deep, platonic affection, a harbor they'd both sailed into for safety, and that her death from cancer 3 years ago had left him not with passionate grief, but with a profound and echoing loneliness. That he measured his days in books read and weekly shops completed. "And you, Art?" Leo asked, his eyes, still a startlingly clear blue, focusing on him. "Anyone special on the scene?" The question was casual, a social punctuation. Arthur took a sip of his mineral water. "No," he said, the word tasting of dust. "No, it's just me." Leo reached over and clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that was surely meant to be reassuring but felt like a minor injury. "Ah well, the freedom, no one to answer to." This became their new rhythm. A weekly lunch. Occasional messages. Leo, Arthur soon understood, was also lonely, though his was a louder, more public variety. He needed an audience for his stories, a witness to his reinvention. Arthur provided a living memory, a testament to the man he had been. And Arthur, foolishly, dangerously, felt the old embers glow. He found himself composing replies to Leo's texts in his head, editing them for a tone of casual wit. He reread their email chains. He replayed their conversations, mining them for hidden meaning, for a glance held a second too long, for a word that could be construed as tender. He was a scholar of a text that did not exist. The longing was different now. It was no longer the sharp, physical ache of youth, but a deeper, more existential yearning. It was the desire not just for Leo, but for the alternative life he represented, a life of boldness, of risk, of feeling. Leo was a walking, talking monument to Arthur's own reticence. Every meeting was a reminder of the love he had never voiced, the chances he had never taken. The regret was a smooth, cold stone in his gut. One drizzly Tuesday in November, they were walking through Hampstead Heath. The leaves were a sodden, colorful carpet underfoot. Leo was talking about buying a flat in Lisbon, about the light there, the cost of living. "You should think about it, Art," he said, his breath misting in the damp air. "A fresh start. We could be two old expats, drinking Vinho Verde and complaining about the youth. The we hung in the air, beautiful and toxic." Arthur's heart performed a pathetic, hopeful stutter. He allowed himself for 3 entire paces to imagine it. The two of them, in a sun-drenched apartment by the sea. The unspoken thing finally spoken. He looked at Leo, really looked. He saw the way Leo's eyes scanned the horizon as he talked of the future, never settling on Arthur. He saw the we was just a word, a rhetorical flourish, as meaningless as hello or see you soon. Leo was painting a scene, and in it, Arthur was just background, a familiar figure to populate his new landscape. He would never look at Arthur and see a protagonist. The understanding arrived not as a shock, but as a quiet, final settling. It was the closing of a book he'd been reading for 45 years. The ending was the same as the beginning. He had simply been too stubborn to put it down. They stopped at the top of Parliament Hill. The city sprawled before them under a grey quilt of cloud, a landscape of a million lives, a million unrequited loves. Leo was still talking about tax implications. Arthur didn't hear him. He felt a strange, serene clarity. The love was still there. It would probably always be there, woven into the fabric of him. But the hope finally was gone. It was a weight removed. He turned to Leo and offered a small, gentle smile, the kind you give a sleeping child. "Lisbon sounds lovely, Leo," he said. His voice even, a calm sea after a long storm. "It really does." Leo beamed, mistaking the tone for agreement, for shared excitement. He launched back into his plans, his voice full of a future that was his alone. Arthur turned back to the view. He felt the chill of the air on his cheeks, the solid earth beneath his feet. He was 64 years old. He was alone. And in the vast, melancholy poetry of that moment, he found not happiness, but a certain peace. It was the peace of knowing at last that the story was over. All that remained was to walk home, through the beautiful fading afternoon by himself. Next, the walk back from the heath was a slow, somatic unfurling of that final, quiet knowledge. Each step away from Leo felt like a step into a new, colder, and more honest air. The drizzle had softened to a mist that clung to his waxed cotton jacket, each droplet a tiny, cold world. He didn't take the tube. He needed the rhythm of his own footsteps, the mundane anchor of crossing streets, waiting for lights, nodding at a stranger walking a terrier. The city, usually a backdrop, felt hyperreal, its edges sharpened by the peculiar clarity of grief. Back in his flat, the silence welcomed him. It was different now. It was no longer an accusatory emptiness but a space he owned. He hung his damp jacket on the hook, towed off his shoes onto the mat, and went to the kitchen. The abandoned chicken breast, still on its board, looked like an artifact from another era. He wrapped it and put it in the fridge. He wasn't hungry. He poured a small whiskey, not for courage or comfort, but for ritual. He took it to his armchair by the window, the one that looked out over the neighboring rooftops, their slate darkened by the rain. He sat, and he let the feeling settle. It wasn't a storm of tears or a crushing weight. It was a vast internal quiet. He had spent a lifetime building a room for Leo in the architecture of his heart, furnishing it with possibility, airing it out with every glance, every joke, every casual wee. Now he was walking through that room for the last time, running a hand over the dust on the shelves and closing the door. The love itself wasn't gone. It was a part of his history, etched into his bones, but the active longing, the constant low-grade hum of maybe, had been switched off. The relief was profound, and it was indistinguishable from sorrow. A week later, Leo's name flashed on his phone. Text. Art, fancy that new Italian on Thursday. Arthur watched the screen until it went dark. He picked up the phone. His thumb hovered. The old impulse, the Pavlovian urge to say yes, to seize any scrap of proximity, was still there, a ghost in the muscle memory. But it was faint. He typed back. Can't this Thursday, I'm afraid. Tied up. It was true. He was tied up. He was tied up with the business of building a life that was entirely his own. The reply came quickly. No worries. Next week. Arthur didn't reply immediately. He made himself a cup of tea, watched a documentary about seabirds. An hour later he wrote, Perhaps. Let me check my diary and get back to you. It was the kind of polite, non-committal brush-off people had been using for centuries. He had just never used it on Leo. There was a power in it, a quiet one. It wasn't about punishment or pettiness. It was about recalibration. Leo could not be the sun around which Arthur's world orbited. He could be, at most, occasional distant comet, interesting to observe, but without any gravitational pull. He did see Leo again eventually. Fell like a test. They met at a museum, a neutral public space full of other quiet conversations and preserved histories. Leo talked, a little too loudly for the galleries. He'd been to Lisbon, had an offer in on an apartment. Arthur listened, nodded, asked appropriate questions. He felt a deep, surprising fondness for this man, this boy he had known. He could see the vulnerability now, the slight desperation under the bravado that he'd been too love-struck to notice before. Leo needed an audience because he was terrified of his own silence. What about you, Art? Leo asked, standing before a vast Turner seascape, all furious light and swirling chaos. Any plans? Arthur looked at the painting, then at Leo. I've joined a poetry reading group, he said. It was true. He'd seen a flyer in the local library, his old domain, and had gone the previous Tuesday. He'd said nothing, just listened to the voices of others, finding a strange comfort in the shared rhythm of words. Leo blinked, slightly nonplussed. Poetry? Really? Yes, Arthur said, a faint smile touching his lips. Really? They parted ways on the steps of the museum. The autumn sun was weak but bright. Leo clapped him on the shoulder again, but this time Arthur didn't flinch. The gesture had lost its power to injure. Keep in touch, Art, Leo said, and there was a new, faintly questioning note in his voice, as if he'd just realized something was different, that the atmosphere between them had subtly changed composition. I will, Arthur said, and he meant it in his own way on his own terms. He walked away, down the great steps, and merged with the flow of pedestrians. He felt the sun on his face, the weight of his keys in his pocket. He thought of the chicken breast in his fridge he would cook for dinner. He thought of the poem he'd been reading that morning, a line by Jane Hirschfield. The heart's capacity for being surprised is not diminished by time or loss. He wasn't happy, but he was present. The long winter of his longing was over. He was, at last, stepping into the fragile, ordinary light of his own life. It was enough. It was, he realized with a calm that felt like a form of grace, more than enough. Next, the poetry group met in the back room of the Persephone, a bookshop cafe tucked down a cobbled mews that smelled of old paper and espresso. Arthur arrived early, as was his nature, and chose a chair slightly outside the circle, near a shelf of cloth-bound classics. He held his anthology, a heavy, well-thumbed Norton, like a shield. They were a disparate group, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s with a shock of white hair, a young man with nervous hands who kept reciting his own verses under his breath, a middle-aged teacher named Brenda who facilitated with a gentle firmness. That evening, the theme was distance. The white-haired woman read a stark piece about a radio telescope listening for signs of life in the silent cosmos. The young man offered something raw and tumultuous about a fractured relationship. Then Brenda's eyes, kind and inquiring, settled on Arthur. "Arthur, would you like to share? Or just listen is fine too." A part of him, the part that had lived a life of careful stage management, wanted to demur, to shrink into the wallpaper. But another part, newer and quieter, remembered the line about the heart's capacity for surprise. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the hushed room. "This is The Promise by Jane Hirschfield," he said. His voice initially a reed, then finding its timbre. He read carefully, giving each word its space. "Stay," I said to the cut flowers. They bowed their heads lower. "Stay," I said to the spider who fled. A leaf. It reddened, embarrassed for me and itself. "Stay," I said to my body. It sat as a dog does, obedient for a moment, soon starting to tremble. "Stay," to the earth of riverine valley meadows, of fossiled escarpments, of limestone and sandstone. It looked back with a changing expression, in silence. "Stay," I said to my loves. Each answered, always. When he finished, the silence in the room was different from the silence of his flat. It was attentive, full. He had offered something, and it had been received. "The imperative of stay," Brenda said softly, "against the inevitable always of the answer. It captures a certain lifelong negotiation, doesn't it?" The white-haired woman nodded. "It's the asking that matters. The beautiful, futile asking." Arthur felt a prickling behind his eyes. He had chosen the poem thinking of Claire, of his parents, of the dog they'd had when he was a boy. But as he read it, he knew he was also reading it for Leo, for the part of himself that had spent decades silently begging someone to stay. And for the first time, he heard the poem not as a lament for the answer, but as a tribute to the courage of the ask. He walked home that night under a clear, cold sky. The city lights were smeared stars. He felt porous, as if the poetry had scoured him out, leaving him clean and empty in a way that was not devoid, but ready. A few days later a postcard arrived. A glossy image of the Geronimo's monastery in Lisbon. On the back, in Leo's familiar, sprawling hand. "Art, sign the papers. Sun is shining. Wish you were here. Truly." The old ache flickered, a phantom limb, but it didn't take hold. He didn't dissect the words for hidden meaning. He didn't imagine himself there. He simply looked at the picture, at the beautiful, distant stonework. He appreciated the sentiment for what it was. A postcard from a friend. He propped it on the mantelpiece, next to a photo of Claire tending her roses. It looked right there. A piece of a life, not the whole puzzle. Winter tightened its grip. Arthur's world, which had felt so desperately small after Claire's death and before the final reckoning with Leo, began paradoxically to expand. It was a quiet expansion, measured in small increments. He started taking a sketchpad to the British Museum, drawing the serene faces of statues. His hand relearning a skill abandoned in his 20s. He had Brenda from the poetry group over for tea. They talked about Elizabeth Bishop for 2 hours, and she didn't once ask him if he was lonely. He thought of Leo less, and when he did, it was without the twisting knife of want. It was with a complex fondness, a gratitude for the history they shared, and a clear-eyed acceptance of its limits. The love was a closed book on a shelf. He knew its story by heart, but he no longer needed to read it every day. One afternoon in early March, a hint of thaw in the air. He was in the Persephone, buying a collection by Ocean Vuong that Brenda had recommended. He was at the counter, fumbling for his reading glasses to check the price, when a woman's voice spoke beside him. "It's a devastating one. In the best way." He turned. It was the white-haired woman from the poetry group. She was holding the same collection. "Oh," Arthur said, flustered. "Yes." Brenda said it was necessary. Brenda is usually right. The woman smiled. Her eyes were a remarkable shade of hazel, flecked with green. I'm Eleanor. Arthur. I know. She nodded toward the back room. You read the Hirschfield. It was a good choice. They stood for a moment in the quiet of the shop, the transaction complete. An opportunity hung in the air, delicate as a cobweb. The old Arthur would have nodded, smiled, and retreated into the safety of the street. But the man who had learned to sit with a vast and honest silence, who had finally closed a door he'd kept open for 45 years, found a different word. I was just about to get a coffee, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. Would you care to join me? We could devastate each other properly. Eleanor's laugh was a warm, unexpected sound in the quiet bookshop. That, she said, sounds like an excellent proposition. He held the door for her. The bell above it chimed. Outside, the sun was weak but persistent, glinting on the wet cobbles. It was not a new beginning. It was not the start of a grand late-life romance. It was simply a coffee, conversation, a connection tentative and small, with another solitary heart navigating the world. But as he pulled out a chair for Eleanor at a small table by the window, Arthur felt it. Not the roaring conflagration of youthful passion, but a small, steady glow, like a lamp lit in a window on a dark evening. It was the quiet, surprising warmth of a life. His life continuing. And for now, in the soft, ordinary light of a bookstore cafe, that was everything. Next, the coffee was hot and bitter. The conversation was not. Eleanor spoke of her work, a lifetime spent restoring damaged manuscripts at the British Library, of the patience required to mend torn vellum, to re-ink faded letters without betraying the hand of the original scribe. It's a lesson in humility, she said, her hands cradling her cup. You are not there to make your mark. You are there to make the existing mark visible again. Arthur listened, captivated less by the details of parchment preparation and more by the metaphor that seemed to hang in the air between them. He told her about the library, about the quiet order of the Dewey Decimal System, the smell of old glue and dust. He did not mention Leo. He mentioned Claire, though, her name spoken softly into the space between them, and it felt not like a betrayal, but an introduction. It sounds, Eleanor said, her hazel eyes thoughtful, like we have both spent our lives tending to other people's stories. The observation landed with a gentle precision. It was true. He had curated narratives written by others, stage-managed them, loved one from the respectful, painful distance of a librarian. He had never considered himself the author. They parted with a promise to see each other at the next poetry group. It was a safe, non-committal arrangement. As Arthur walked home, the Vong collection in his bag, he felt a peculiar lightness. The interaction had been pleasant, unburdened. There was no subtext to decode, no hope to desperately kindle. It was simply two people who had shared a coffee. The following week Leo called. His voice was a crackle of Mediterranean static and exuberance. Art. The light here, it's unbelievable. You wouldn't believe it. The tiles on my terrace, they're the color of the sea. You have to come. Seriously. I've got a spare room with your name on it. The invitation was expansive, typical Leo. The old script was there, waiting for him to pick it up. To fall into the role of the appreciative audience, the quiet companion to Leo's brilliant solo performance. He could picture it. The sun-drenched terrace, the cold Vinho Verde, the long, lonely evenings after Leo had gone out to meet his new, interesting friends, leaving Arthur to tidy up. Arthur looked out his window. The London sky was a soft, pearlescent gray. A pigeon was building a nest on the ledge opposite. It was a mess of twigs and determination. It sounds beautiful, Leo, he said, and he meant it. But I can't. I've made commitments here. The word commitments felt too grand, but it was the only one that came to mind. It encompassed the poetry group, his tentative sketching, the possibility of another coffee with Eleanor. It was the architecture of his own life, finally under construction. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Leo was not used to hearing no. It didn't come from anger or hurt, but from genuine baffled surprise. Commitments. What more important than Lisbon sunshine? He laughed, but the laugh was slightly hollow, a performance without its intended applause. Just things I'm doing, Arthur said, his voice calm. He felt no need to justify or elaborate. His life was no longer an open book for Leo to skim. Another pause, longer this time. Arthur could almost hear the recalibration happening across the continent. Leo's tone when he spoke again was different. Softer. Less sure of itself. Right. Well, the offer stands, Art. Anytime. Thank you, Leo. I appreciate that. They hung up. Arthur placed the phone on the table. The silence in the flat felt deep and earned. He had drawn a boundary, and the world had not ended. The sky had not fallen. In fact, the pigeon had successfully added another twig to its nest. He opened the Vaughan collection. The poems were indeed devastating. They spoke of war and trauma and a fierce, fragile love between a mother and son. They were about the stories we inherit and the ones we claw out for ourselves. He read one, then another, his breath catching in his throat at the raw beauty of the language. He thought of Eleanor's hands, mending torn pages. He thought of his own heart, which had felt so tattered for so long. It wasn't mended, not completely. The love for Leo was a scar now, a part of his history that had healed over, leaving only a faint white line to show where the wound had been. It no longer hurt to the touch. That evening, he didn't rehearse a text to Leo in his mind. He didn't reread old emails. Instead, he found himself thinking of a line from one of the poems. The most beautiful part of your body is where it's headed. And remember, loneliness is still time spent with the world. He picked up his phone again. This time, his thumb moved with a new purpose. He found the number Brenda had given him for the group's logistics. Eleanor, it's Arthur from the reading group. I'm tackling Ocean Vuong and finding it as devastating as promised. I wondered if you might be free for another coffee sometime. I could use a guide through the wreckage. He pressed send before he could second-guess the slight whimsy of the message. He did not wait for a reply. He placed the phone face down on the table and went to make his dinner. He was slicing a mushroom, focusing on the thin, perfect discs falling from the knife, when the phone buzzed. A single word lit up the screen. Tomorrow. Next. The rain began as a soft percussion on the skylight above Arthur's bed, a sound that usually lulled him. Tonight it felt like an accusation. He had woken from a dream that was already disintegrating, leaving behind only its emotional residue, a sharp, familiar ache of longing. In the dream he'd been young and Leo had been looking at him, really looking at him with an understanding that had never existed in life. The feeling was so vivid, so corporeal, it had followed him out of sleep. He lay in the dark, the ghost of the feeling clinging to him. The clarity of the afternoon, the quiet victory of saying no to Leo, felt distant and intellectual. This was something older, written in the marrow. It was the body's stubborn memory of hope. He rose, pulling on his dressing gown. The flat was a landscape of shadows. He didn't turn on the lights. He went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. The postcard of Lisbon was a pale rectangle on the mantelpiece. He looked away. It was a relapse, not of love but of habit. A neural pathway worn so deep over decades that his mind, in its unconscious state, still defaulted to it. Knowing it was a ghost didn't make the chill of its presence any less real. He thought of Eleanor, of her calm hazel eyes, of the easy quiet between them. It felt fragile suddenly, a tiny fledgling thing next to the monolithic lifelong obsession with Leo. What did he have to offer her? A heart that was still, on some ancient cellular level, rehearsing arguments for a man who had never listened. He was not a new man. He was an old man who had simply decided to stop watering a dead plant. But the roots were still there, deep and dry, and sometimes they shifted in the earth. The rain intensified. He stood at the living room window, watching the water sheet down the glass, distorting the city lights into smears of gold and white. He saw his own reflection superimposed on the chaos, an old man in a dark room, his face etched with the lines of a story he was trying to stop telling. He had believed that peace was a destination, that he would arrive one day at a state of grace where the past held no power. But perhaps it was a continuous negotiation, a daily choice to turn away from the siren call of a familiar melancholy, to face the less dramatic, more uncertain present. He thought of the line from Vong he'd read earlier: "Loneliness is still time spent with the world." His loneliness for Leo had been a world unto itself, a vast, intricate country he had inhabited for most of his life. Leaving it was not like closing a door. It was like emigrating. There were moments of profound disorientation, a longing for the crooked, familiar streets of that old sorrow. He would see Eleanor tomorrow. The thought now brought a tremor of anxiety, not anticipation. It would be so easy to cancel, to retreat into the known quantity of his own solitude, to spare her the mess of his unfinished history. He went to his armchair and sat, not reading, not thinking, just letting the rain fill the silence. He simply witnessed the feeling. He didn't try to argue with it or fix it. He let it be. And slowly, as the night wore on, the sharp edge of the dreamache began to soften, diluted by the sheer, boring passage of time. By the time the first gray light of dawn seeped into the room, the storm inside him had passed. The rain had gentled to a drizzle. The ache was gone, leaving behind only a tired clarity. He felt weathered like a stone smoothed by a relentless sea. He got up, his bones creaking. He made tea. The routine was an anchor. He did not check his phone. He did not look at the postcard. When it was a respectable hour, he sent a text. Not to Leo. To Eleanor. "Good morning. I hope I didn't promise too much devastation over coffee. Still on for today." He held the phone in his hand. This was the choice. Not a grand, final one, but a small, daily one. To choose the tentative, uncertain possibility of a new connection over the deep, comfortable groove of an old pain. The reply came a few minutes later. "Good morning, Arthur. I have a high tolerance for devastation. I'll see you at 2. He placed the phone down. He would go. He would sit with her. He would talk about poetry and restoration and the weather. He would probably be a little quiet, a little distant, the ghost of last night's dream still trailing behind him. And that would have to be okay. This was the work. Not of erasing the past, but of building a present in spite of it. He was not a clean slate. He was a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped clean and written over, but with the faint, indelible traces of the old story still visible beneath the new words. Perhaps that was all anyone was. Perhaps Eleanor, with her skill in such things, would understand. Next, the Persephone was sun-drenched this time, the afternoon light catching motes of dust that danced like slow atoms over the bookshelves. Eleanor was already there, at the same table by the window. She wore a deep green cardigan that made her eyes seem even more like forest pools. She did not smile as he approached, but her expression was one of open, calm attention. It was not a demand, but an offer. "You look like you've been wrestling with more than just Ocean Vong," she said as he sat down. Her voice held no pity, only a straightforward curiosity. Arthur let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh. The directness was disarming, and a relief. "A poor night's sleep," he admitted. "The past has a way of revisiting. Uninvited." She nodded, stirring her latte. "It does. It's a terrible guest. Doesn't know when it's overstayed its welcome." She looked out the window for a moment. "I dream of my husband sometimes. Robert. He's been gone 8 years. In the dreams, he's always just forgotten to tell me something terribly important, and I'm frantic for him to remember. I wake up feeling like I've failed a test." Arthur was stunned into silence. It was such an intimate, precise confession, offered without ceremony. It laid bare the mechanics of a specific grief. He had expected polite questions about the weather, the state of the pavements, the quality of the coffee. He had not expected this. This morning, he found himself saying, the words coming from a place he usually kept boarded up. I woke up missing someone who was never really mine to miss. Felt embarrassingly adolescent and utterly real. Eleanor considered this. The heart's a terrible archivist, she said. It doesn't file things correctly. It just shoves the most potent things in a box labeled, now, and leaves us to sort through the mess. They talked for an hour. Not about the broad strokes of their lives, but about the grain of their loneliness. Arthur spoke of the flat silence. Eleanor spoke of the particular agony of cooking for one after 40 years of cooking for two. He mentioned, without naming him, a friend who had always been a gravitational force, and the recent difficult work of stepping out of his orbit. It sounds, Eleanor said, finishing the last of her coffee, like you are learning to be the protagonist of your own story. It's a late promotion for most of us. The simplicity of the phrase struck him. Protagonist of his own story. Was exactly that. He had been a supporting character for so long. The reliable friend, the devoted husband, the quiet employee. The man who loved from the wings. It's a quiet story, he said a little self-consciously. Not much happens. Eleanor's smile was warm, crinkling the corners of her eyes. Those are the best kinds. The loud ones are exhausting. She gathered her bag. I have to go. I'm attempting to repot an orchid. It's a dramatic standoff between hope and horticultural incompetence. He stood as she did. Thank you, Eleanor. For the coffee. And the company in the mess, she offered. Yes, that. She left, and the cafe seemed to hold her absence like a gentle echo. Arthur sat back down, not yet ready to break the spell of the conversation. He looked at his reflection in the window, superimposed over the passers-by. He did not see an old man haunted by regret. He saw a man who had just shared a difficult truth and had it met not with alarm, but with understanding. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He knew, with a certainty that felt like strength, that it would be Leo. Another sun-drenched photo, another breezy update, another unconscious pull on a leash he had finally dropped. He finished his tea, which had gone cold. He paid the bill. He stepped out into the afternoon, the light now softening to gold. He walked towards the tube station, and only when he was seated on a bench on the platform, the rumble of an approaching train vibrating through the concrete, did he take out his phone. There was a photo message from Leo. A plate of golden sardines, a glass of white wine, a sliver of blue sea in the background. The message. Wish you were here to share this, old man. Arthur looked at the picture. He appreciated its beauty. He felt a genuine warmth for the man who had sent it. But the words no longer hooked into his flesh. They were just words. He did not fall into the old mental calculation of how to reply, how to be witty enough, warm enough, present enough in his absence. He typed a simple, true reply. Looks wonderful. Enjoy. He pressed send. The train hissed into the station, its doors sliding open. He stood, pocketed the phone, and stepped on board. He found a seat and looked at the faces around him. Tired, bored, illuminated by the blue glow of their screens. Each the protagonist of their own quiet, tumultuous, ongoing story. He was going home to his flat, to his silence, to his single chicken breast. But it felt different. The silence was his. The story was his. It was a modest story, perhaps, but it was his to write. And for the first time in a very, very long time, he was curious to see what would happen on the next page.